Early this morning, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called an emergency meeting of the North Atlantic Council in Brussels. On the table, a vote on the Alternative Security Partnership Fund put forward by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The whole thing was scheduled with less than a day's notice. American officials who'd flown in overnight worked the phones in the hallways trying to delay the vote or peel off enough members to kill it. It didn't work. At 9:15 in the morning Brussels time, 3:15 in the dead of night back in Washington, the vote was called. The result wasn't close. 23 NATO members said yes to establishing the fund. Only 5 said no: the United States, Hungary, Slovakia, Turkey, and Croatia. 3 sat on the fence. Now, let me tell you what that fund actually is, because this is the kind of fine print that matters. The Alternative Security Partnership Fund is now official NATO machinery. It's capitalized at $94.7 billion in committed money from participating members. It runs on qualified majority voting, which means the United States has no veto. Any NATO member facing a credible security threat can access it, regardless of where that threat originates. In plain terms, for 77 years, Washington held the pen when NATO made decisions. A combination of money, military might, and a consensus rule that gave America effective veto power kept it that way. This morning, 23 countries took the pen away, and the man who drew up the plan, built the coalition, and executed it in roughly 1 week was Mark Carney. Canada just rewired NATO's power structure, and Washington is scrambling. Let me walk you through how it happened. The U.S. delegation arrived in Brussels Wednesday evening with a clear playbook. They argued the fund violated NATO's founding charter, that it created competing structures that would fracture alliance unity, and, according to sources, they made implied threats. Vote yes, and your bilateral relationship with Washington takes a hit. Reduced military support, less intelligence sharing, the whole menu of pressure tactics. Canada was running a different operation entirely. Carney flew to Brussels Wednesday afternoon, but instead of threatening, he asked questions. He'd sit across from an ambassador and say, "Can your country actually count on American security guarantees? Can you be certain a future U.S. president won't use your alliance membership as a bargaining chip? Does the current setup, where Washington can veto anything, truly serve your interests?" Then he'd offer a simple proposition. The fund isn't a replacement for NATO, it's insurance. If the United States stays reliable, you'll never need it. But if it doesn't, you won't be left exposed. That framing landed hard with smaller members who've always worried about being abandoned when great powers start horse trading. The Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Carney locked them in one by one. Even Poland, which had been expected to side with Washington out of fear of losing U.S. troop support, voted yes after Carney privately committed to advocating for Polish interests within the fund's governance structure. By the time the council convened Thursday morning, the count was already settled. The U.S. knew it had lost before the vote was even called. The yes votes: Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Greece, Czech Republic, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Luxembourg, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovenia, and Montenegro. The no votes: the United States, Hungary, Slovakia, Turkey, and Croatia. Albania, North Macedonia, and Finland abstained. Secretary General Rutte announced the fund is established. Governance rules will be finalized within 30 days, and member states can submit funding requests immediately. Now let me show you what happened in Washington when the news landed, because the reaction tells you everything about how badly this caught the administration off guard. When the vote concluded at 3:15 a.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. ambassador to NATO called the National Security Advisor. The conversation lasted under 3 minutes. The ambassador said, "We lost 23-5. The fund is established. Carney won." The National Security Advisor reportedly responded with language unsuitable for polite company, then said, "Wake everyone up. We have a crisis." By 3:45 a.m., the Secretaries of State and Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were all on an emergency call. By 4:30 a.m., the President was awake and being briefed. According to sources, Trump's first question was, "What does this mean?" The National Security Advisor explained that NATO had just created a funding mechanism that operates entirely outside U.S. control, that 23 allies had voted for it over American objections, and that this was a structural loss of American influence over an alliance Washington had dominated for nearly 8 decades. By 6 a.m., the Pentagon had a classified assessment ready. People who've seen it say the conclusions weren't reassuring. The document stated that the fund creates an alternative decision-making layer within NATO, one that can authorize military operations, intelligence sharing, and defense expenditures without American participation or sign-off. It warned that allied nations will increasingly turn to the ASPF rather than Washington for security assurances. It noted that U.S. military bases in Europe could face reduced host nation support as European defense dollars get redirected. The bottom line, the United States has lost its structural advantage inside NATO and must now compete for influence rather than assume it. Career diplomats at the State Department were equally rattled. Sources there are calling the Brussels vote the worst single day for American diplomacy since the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And the concern isn't limited to Europe. If 23 NATO members are willing to publicly defy Washington and build a security mechanism without U.S. control, what message does that send to allies in Asia? In the Middle East, the State Department is warning this could trigger a cascade. Partners in other regions building their own alternative frameworks because they no longer trust American reliability. At 10 a.m. Brussels time, Carney held a press conference outside NATO headquarters. He was composed, precise, and measured, the kind of manner that tends to unsettle the people on the other side of the table. He said the fund strengthens the alliance, supplements existing structures rather than replacing them, and ensures no member is left without recourse when facing a credible threat. He thanked the 22 member nations who supported the initiative and said Canada looks forward to working with all allies, including the United States, to make it succeed. Then he announced that Canada is immediately submitting the fund's first formal request, $8.2 billion for Arctic defenses, satellite communications, and cyber capabilities. The same items Canada had been trying to get funded through traditional NATO channels for weeks. The Governance Committee has 15 days to review it. Here's the deeper significance, and I want you to think about this carefully. For 77 years, NATO ran on one unwritten rule. America leads, allies follow, and nothing of consequence happens without Washington's approval. That rule no longer applies. If NATO can establish a $95 billion fund over U.S. objections, the next questions write themselves. Can NATO authorize military operations without American sign-off? Can it establish partnerships with non-member states without U.S. agreement? Can it adopt defense policies that run contrary to U.S. preferences? The answer to all of those questions is now yes. Washington still has a seat at the table and a vote, but it's one vote among 32, not the controlling voice. Back in Washington, the day continued to unravel. At 8 a.m., Trump met with his national security team. According to sources, he wanted to announce immediate withdrawal from NATO. His advisors explained, again, that withdrawal requires congressional approval and Congress won't provide it. Trump reportedly asked what he could do on his own. The options were thin: reduce troop presence in Europe, scale back intelligence sharing, or condition future support on reforms to the ASPF. Every option carried its own risk. Reducing troops or pulling back on intelligence sharing would validate exactly the concerns that drove allies to create the fund in the first place. Conditioning support on reforms hands allies leverage they can use against you. At 11 a.m., the White House released a statement. It expressed deep disappointment, called the fund unnecessary bureaucracy, said the U.S. would not contribute and would monitor how the money is used, and asked allies to prioritize traditional NATO structures. That statement, if you read it carefully, is the sound of an institution with no good options. There were no concrete consequences named, no specific actions announced. Allies noticed. The Pentagon then issued its own statement in a noticeably different register, saying the United States remains committed to NATO and will work with allies through all NATO mechanisms, including the newly established ASPF. That's the military apparatus signaling that U.S. cooperation continues regardless of the political noise, essentially accepting the fund as a legitimate structure. Congress weighed in quickly. A dozen Senate Republicans who've broken with the administration throughout this episode released a statement saying 23 allies just voted against the United States because Washington has made American leadership something people want insurance against. Chuck Schumer said the president had lost control of the alliance America built. Senator Lindsey Graham said the 23 countries made a mistake and would eventually realize how much they need the United States. Now, let me give you 3 ways this could play out because in my experience, the range of outcomes matters more than any single prediction. The first scenario I'd call the graceful retreat. Over the next 2 months, the administration's advisors convinced the president that the ASPF isn't going away, and that continued confrontation only deepens the damage. The U.S. quietly joins governance discussions, doesn't contribute money, but stops actively obstructing. America retains considerable influence. It's still the world's most powerful military after all, but no longer holds veto power. Think of it as managed adjustment rather than collapse. NATO continues, American participation continues, but the dynamic shifts permanently. The second scenario is the parallel track. Washington creates its own competing mechanism, call it an American Security Partnership Fund, and tries to split the alliance by offering similar benefits to members willing to work outside the ASPF. NATO becomes 2 overlapping systems pulling in different directions. Some countries participate in both. The alliance stays unified on paper but fractured in practice, and everyone wastes energy on internal competition rather than actual defense coordination. I'd call this the expensive mistake scenario. The third scenario is the one that would take the longest to play out but carries the most weight. The ASPF gradually becomes the primary vehicle for European defense cooperation. Over the next 5 years, defense spending flows predominantly through the fund rather than through traditional NATO channels. The U.S. remains a member but becomes increasingly peripheral. American bases in Europe get scaled back. By the end of the decade, NATO functions as a European-led organization with American participation, not the other way around. The alliance network that supported American global military dominance for nearly a century reorganizes itself around a different center of gravity. What I'll be watching, whether Canada's $8.2 billion request gets approved within 15 days, whether other NATO members line up with similar requests, and whether this White House makes any serious attempt to repair the relationships with the 23 allies who just voted the other way. 23 NATO members voted to reduce American control. Mark Carney proposed it, built it, and won it. Canada restructured NATO in a single week, and Washington, as of right now, has no clear answer.